What happens when a legend steps onto a stage expecting respect, only to face a smirking host ready to tear him down? The lights of the Jimmy Kimmel live studio blazed hot, the audience buzzing with excitement. Clint Eastwood, the man who'd stared down outlaws on screen and crafted films that defined generations, walked out to applause. At 85, his presence still commanded the room, his sharp eyes cutting through the glare. Jimmy Kimmel, all grins and slick charm, leaned back in his chair, ready to play the provocateur. The crowd expected a friendly chat, maybe some stories about Hollywood's golden days. They didn't know they were about to witness a verbal brawl that would shake the airwaves. Clint settled into the guest chair, his weathered hands folded, expecting questions about his new film, a gritty war drama that had critics whispering Oscar. But Jimmy had other plans. The host's smile turned sharp, like a blade hidden in velvet. He leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief. "Clint, let's be real," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your movies, they're a bit old-fashioned, right? I mean, do people even care about your kind of stories anymore?" The audience gasped, a murmur rippling through the crowd. Clint's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching like they were reaching for a gun in one of his old westerns. "You saying, my work's irrelevant, kid?" Clint's voice was low, gravelly, each word a bullet. The crowd hushed, sensing the storm brewing. Jimmy, unfazed, doubled down. "Come on, Clint. You're a relic. This ain't the 70s. People want fresh, not some dusty cowboy flick." The insult landed like a slap, and the audience shifted, uncomfortable but riveted. Clint's eyes narrowed, his stare cold enough to freeze the stage. "You think you know what people want?" he growled. "You're a talk show hack, poking fun to get laughs. I've been telling stories that last. What have you done that'll be remembered in 10 years? Jimmy's face flushed, but he wasn't backing off. He leaned closer, his voice loud enough for the mics to catch every syllable. "Oh, please, Clint. Your last movie tanked. Maybe it's time to hang up the spurs, old man." The crowd erupted, some cheering Jimmy's audacity, others booing his disrespect. Clint's hand slammed the armrest, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You got no idea what it takes to make something real," he snapped. "You sit here cracking jokes while I've spent 50 years building something that matters. You want to talk tanking? Look at your ratings lately." The stage felt smaller, the air thick with hostility. Jimmy's smirk faltered, but he recovered fast, turning to the audience with a fake laugh. "Wow, touchy, huh? Guess the truth hurts." He was playing to the crowd, but Clint wasn't here for games. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Truth? Here's truth. You invited me here to prop up your little show, and now you're trying to tear me down to look clever. You're out of your depth, son." The audience roared, split between shock and admiration. A producer in the wings signaled to cut to commercial, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the escalating war. Jimmy, stung by Clint's words, dropped the charm. His voice turned venomous. "You think you're untouchable? Because you're a legend? Newsflash, Clint, legends fade. Nobody's rushing to see your movies anymore." Clint stood, towering over the desk, his presence like a thundercloud. "You want to talk fading? Look in the mirror. You're nothing without guests like me to keep your show afloat." The crowd was on its feet, the tension electric. As the segment teetered on chaos, a stagehand whispered to Jimmy, urging him to cool it. But Jimmy waved him off, his ego too big to back down. Clint, meanwhile, wasn't done. His next words would set the stage ablaze, and the audience was hanging on every syllable. The studio lights flickered, as if the electricity itself felt the strain of the showdown unfolding. Clint Eastwood stood tall, his shadow looming over Jimmy Kimmel's desk, his words still ringing in the air. The audience, a mix of stunned silence and restless murmurs, couldn't peel their eyes away. Backstage, producers scrambled, headsets crackling with panicked orders to cut the feed. But the network execs, sensing a ratings spike, demanded the cameras keep rolling. Jimmy, his face red with a mix of anger and embarrassment, gripped his note cards tightly, his knuckles white. He wasn't about to let an 85-year-old icon make him look small on his own stage. "You think you're some kind of hero, Clint?" Jimmy spat, his voice loud and bitter. "You're just an old guy clinging to a world that's moved on. Your films are for grandpas, not audiences." The crowd gasped, some shouting in protest, others egging Jimmy on, thrilled by the chaos. Clint's eyes blazed, but he didn't move, his stillness more menacing than any step forward. "You're digging your own grave, Kimmel," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "You mock what you don't understand. My films, they're about courage, sacrifice. Things you'd know nothing about, sitting there with your cheap jokes." Jimmy slammed his cards on the desk, the sound snapping through the studio. "Courage? You're a has-been who can't take criticism. Maybe if you made something worth watching, we wouldn't be having this talk." The audience roared, divided, some clapping for Clint's defiance, others cheering Jimmy's nerve. A woman in the front row yelled, "Show some respect, Kimmel." But Jimmy ignored her, leaning forward, his smirk gone, replaced by a scowl. "You're here because I invited you, Clint. You need me more than I need you. Without this show, your movie's just another flop." That was the spark that lit the fuse. Clint's hand clenched into a fist, not raised, but heavy with intent. "Need you?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. "I was filling theaters when you were still begging for a comedy gig. You're a vulture, picking at people's work, to stay relevant." The crowd erupted, some standing, others shouting, the studio a cauldron of noise. Backstage, a producer waved frantically at Jimmy, mouthing, "Tone it down!" But Jimmy was too far gone, his ego bruised, his temper flaring. He stood now, matching Clint's height, though he lacked the gravitas. "You're pathetic," Jimmy hissed. "You think you're untouchable? I could end your comeback with one segment." The threat hung in the air, bold and reckless. Then came the twist. A voice from the audience broke through, loud and clear. "Jimmy, you stole his script." It was an older man, gray-haired, wearing a faded jacket, his face flushed with anger. The crowd turned, stunned, as he stood, pointing at Jimmy. "I worked on Clint's crew years ago. You took his story idea, pitched it as your own, and now you're trashing him?" Gasps filled the room. Jimmy's face froze, his eyes darting, to the man, then to Clint. The accusation was a bomb, and the studio felt like it might explode. Clint's head tilted, his gaze locking onto Jimmy like a hawk. "That true, Kimmel?" he asked, his voice calm but lethal. "You been stealing from me and calling it your own?" Jimmy stammered, caught off guard, his confidence crumbling. That's ridiculous," he managed, but his voice shook, and the audience sensed weakness. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some chanting Clint's name, others yelling at Jimmy to explain. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every bead of sweat on Jimmy's forehead. Clint stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You got a lot of nerve, kid," he said. "Stealing a man's work, and then spitting in his face on live TV. You want to talk courage? Let's see you talk your way out of this." The audience was on edge, waiting for Jimmy's next move, knowing whatever came next would be explosive. The studio air crackled with raw energy, every eye glued to the stage where Clint Eastwood and Jimmy Kimmel faced off. The accusation of theft, thrown out by a former crew member, hung heavy, like smoke after a gunshot. The audience buzzed, some whispering, others shouting, their loyalty split between the legend and the host. Jimmy, his face pale but eyes burning, stood behind his desk, gripping its edge as if it could anchor him. Clint, unmoving, stared him down, his silence louder than any shout. The cameras, relentless, caught every twitch, every bead of sweat, broadcasting the chaos to millions. Jimmy forced a laugh, sharp and hollow, trying to claw back control. "This is absurd," he said, his voice loud but unsteady. Some random guy yells nonsense, and you all believe him? Clint, you're desperate, clinging to lies to save your fading career. The crowd booed, sensing his dodge, but Jimmy pushed on, his words venomous. You're a fossil, Eastwood. You think anyone cares about your old stories? I built this show from nothing. I don't need to steal from you. His sneer was bold, but his shaking hands betrayed him, and the audience noticed. Clint stepped, closer, his boots heavy on the stage floor, each step a warning. You built nothing, he said, his voice low, cutting. You ride on the backs of people like me, then stab us when it suits you. That script you're talking about? I wrote it 10 years ago, poured my soul into it. You think I don't know my own work? The crowd gasped, leaning forward, hooked on every word. A woman in the back shouted, Tell him, Clint! The support fueled him, his eyes never leaving Jimmy. You took my story, sold it as yours, and now you're trashing me to cover it up. That's low, even for you. Jimmy's eyes darted to the audience, then to the producers in the wings, who were frozen, unsure whether to stop the train wreck or let it burn for ratings. He leaned forward, his voice rising to a shout. You're delusional. I've got writers, a team, a career. You're just mad because nobody wants your movies anymore. The insult was a wild swing, but it landed flat. The audience roared, some chanting, Clint! Clint! Others hurling insults at Jimmy. A man in a cowboy hat stood yelling, You're a thief, Kimmel! The studio was a powder keg, ready to blow. Backstage, a young assistant whispered to a producer, Should we pull the plug? The producer shook his head, eyes wide, knowing this was gold for the network. On stage, Clint's voice dropped to a growl, each word deliberate. You want to talk careers? Mine's lasted 60 years because I tell the truth. You're a flash gone by next season. And stealing from me? That's a mistake you'll regret. The threat landed hard, the crowd erupting in cheers. Jimmy, cornered, snapped back. Regret? You'll regret coming here, old man. I'll make sure your little film never sees a theater. That was the breaking point. The audience surged to their feet, some outraged, others thrilled by the raw drama. Clint's face hardened, but a faint smile crept in, like a man who'd seen worse and come out on top. You don't scare me, Kimmel, he said, his voice steady as steel. You can't bury the truth, and you can't bury me. He turned to the audience, raising a hand, and they roared louder, their support a tidal wave. Jimmy, flustered, opened his mouth to fire back, but a new sound cut through, sharp and unexpected, shifting the battle in a way neither man saw coming. Sharp crack echoed through the studio, silencing the roaring crowd. Heads turned as a woman strode onto the stage, holding a stack of papers, her face set with determination. She was Ellen Carter, a retired screenwriter who'd worked with Clint decades ago, her presence commanding respect. The audience hushed, sensing the tide turning. Jimmy Kimmel froze, his eyes wide, while Clint Eastwood stood steady, his gaze shifting to her, curious but unshaken. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment that would seal the night's fate. Jimmy, Ellen said, her voice clear and firm. These are the original drafts of Clint's script, the one you claimed, as yours. She held up the papers, yellowed but unmistakable, stamped with Clint's name. The crowd gasped, murmurs spreading like wildfire. I kept them all these years, she continued. You pitched a comedy last year, same plot, same heart, just twisted to fit your cheap gags. You stole from a man who trusted you. The accusation landed like a hammer, and the audience erupted, some shouting, Shame on you, Kimmel! Others cheering for Ellen's courage. Jimmy's face drained of color, his hands fumbling for words. This is a setup, he stammered, his voice cracking. You're all ganging up on me! But the crowd wasn't buying it. Boos rained down, loud and unforgiving. Clint stepped forward, his voice calm but piercing. "You thought you could take my work, smear my name, and walk away clean?" he said. "You're not just a thief, Kimmel. You're a coward." The words cut deep, and the audience roared, their support for Clint shaking the studio walls. Ellen handed the papers to a producer who nodded, stunned, as the evidence circulated backstage. Jimmy, desperate, turned to the crowd, his voice shrill. "You believe them? They're lying to save his flop of a movie." But his plea fell flat, drowned by jeers. A man in the audience stood shouting, "We stand with Clint." The chant spread, growing louder until the studio vibrated with it. Jimmy sank into his chair, defeated, his smirk gone, his career teetering on the edge. Clint faced the audience, his weathered face lit with quiet pride. "I've spent my life telling stories that matter," he said, his voice steady, resonating with every soul in the room. "Not for fame, not for money, but because they're true. This man tried to take that from me, but he forgot one thing. Truth always wins." The crowd leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping tears. Backstage, producers scrambled to manage the fallout, but the damage was done. The network cut to commercial, but not before the world saw Jimmy's humiliation. As Clint walked off stage, Ellen at his side, the audience kept chanting his name. Jimmy sat alone, the lights dimming, his head bowed. Word spread fast. The stolen script was real, and the industry was turning on him. Clint's film, once doubted, soared in buzz, theaters booking it overnight. The legend had faced down a bully and won, not with fists, but with the weight of his legacy. The audience left, the studio buzzing, inspired, knowing they'd witnessed a moment that would echo for years.